Plymouth Harbor, January 1944. Admiral Sir Charles Little, Commander-in-Chief of Portsmouth, stood at his office window, watching another convoy enter the Sound. 18 American Liberty ships, their gray hulls riding low with cargo, their decks stacked with crates and vehicles lashed down under tarpaulins. He'd counted 43 such convoys in the past 2 weeks alone. He turned to his logistics officer. "How many total now?" "American vessels currently in our port, sir." The officer consulted his clipboard. 217, as of this morning's count. That's not including the landing, craft still in construction, or the vessels we expect next week. Little nodded slowly. He'd been coordinating naval operations for 3 decades. He'd seen the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow. He'd watched the evacuation from Dunkirk. He understood naval logistics at a scale most men couldn't imagine. But this was different. The Americans weren't just contributing to an invasion fleet. They were building one from scratch on British soil faster than seemed physically possible. The first American vessels had arrived in Britain for Operation Overlord, planning in late 1943. Small numbers initially, a few destroyers, some transports, the advanced elements of what would become the Western Naval Task Force. Under Rear Admiral Alan Kirk, British planners had reviewed the numbers, understood the American commitment, and approved the allocations. But understanding numbers on paper and watching those numbers materialize in your harbors were entirely different experiences. By February, the trickle had become a flood. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief for Operation Neptune, maintained his headquarters at Southwark House near Portsmouth. A meticulous planner, Ramsay had orchestrated the Dunkirk evacuation and understood complex naval operations better than almost anyone alive. The plan called for nearly 7,000 vessels total. The Americans would provide roughly 3,000 of them. 3,000 vessels. Ramsay had written the number countless times in reports. But watching them actually arrive day after day, week after week, created a different kind of comprehension. In early March, Ramsay stood on the deck of HMS Largs. His headquarters ship as an American convoy entered the Solent. He counted the vessels through his binoculars. 22 LSTs, landing ship, tank, each capable of carrying 20 Sherman tanks or 33 trucks. Behind the LSTs came a line of smaller landing craft LCILs, each designed to carry 200 troops. He counted 34 of them in his convoy alone. His flag lieutenant approached. "Sir, the convoy manifest shows 41 more LSTs scheduled to arrive at Plymouth tomorrow, and another convoy of 67 LC is the day after." Ramsay lowered his binoculars. "Where are they putting them all?" Plymouth was reporting they were anchoring them in lines extending 3 miles into the Sound. Falmouth was reporting they were packed so tight the harbor master said you could walk from ship to ship across the entire harbor. This wasn't exaggeration. British port commanders were sending increasingly desperate reports about space. The southern coast of England had become one vast naval parking lot, with American vessels filling every available anchorage, every harbor, every inlet deep enough to float a hull. The Americans were also bringing their own port facilities. In April, British engineers, watched with professional fascination as American construction battalions, Seabees, assembled floating piers at Portland. They weren't adapting to existing ports. They were building their own. By late April, British civilians living along the southern coast found their familiar landscapes transformed. Harbors they'd known there, entire lives had become forests of masts and superstructures. The sea itself seemed to have disappeared beneath hulls. A fisherman from Weymouth, forbidden from taking his boat out, stood on the harbor wall and counted American vessels until he reached 300 and gave up. "The water's gone," he told a reporter. "Just ships now, as far as you can see." The American contribution wasn't just numbers. It was the types of vessels that revealed the depth of American industrial planning. Admiral Sir Philip Vian, commanding the Eastern Task Force, toured the American anchorages in early May. At Plymouth, he boarded the USS Nevada, a battleship sunk at Pearl Harbor, raised, repaired, and sailed across 2 oceans to support the invasion. Her 14-inch guns could throw a shell weighing 1,400 pounds more than 20 miles inland. "She's one of 3 battleships we're bringing," the American liaison explained. "Texas and Arkansas are at Portland. Plus, we've got 3 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, and 34 destroyers assigned to the Western Task Force alone." Vian did the mental arithmetic. The Americans were bringing more heavy naval gunfire support to their 2 beaches than the entire Royal Navy had available for the 3 British beaches. But the battleships, impressive as they were, weren't what made the invasion possible. The landing craft were. By late May, the final counts were becoming clear. The Americans had delivered more than 2,000 landing craft of various types: LSTs, LCIs, LCTs. They had built over 1,000 of the ocean-crossing LSTs, and hundreds were now packed into British harbors. The small Higgins boats, LCVPs, that would actually carry troops to the beaches numbered in the thousands. At Dieppe 2 years earlier, they'd scraped together enough landing craft for 5,000 men. Now, looking at the fleet, they were planning to land 156,000 men on the first day alone. The speed was another shock. British industry had been on war footing for 5 years. American industry had ramped up in half the time and was outproducing Britain by factors that seemed impossible. A British admiral's logistics officer, reviewing production figures, found numbers that made him recalculate 3 times. In 1943 alone, American shipyards had launched more than 2,000 specialized amphibious vessels. "They're not building ships," one British officer observed. "They're manufacturing them." The Liberty ships were being completed at a rate of 3 per day across American shipyards. Some yards were launching a completed vessel every 4 days from a single slipway. The difference was more than semantic. The result was visible in every British port by late May 1944. Admiral Ramsay held his final planning conference on May 28. He stood before a massive map showing the final dispositions. "Gentlemen, the final count," Ramsay said. 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary vessels, 864 merchant ships. He paused. Of these, the American contribution is approximately 3,000 vessels, including the majority of our LSTs and a substantial portion of our fire support ships. Every officer present understood naval logistics. They knew these numbers represented not just ships, but the industrial capacity of an entire nation bent toward a single purpose. On June 4th, Eisenhower postponed the invasion 24 hours due to weather. The challenge of keeping this massive fleet organized and supplied for an additional day was immense. Fuel, food, water all had to be redistributed to thousands of vessels. The Americans had anticipated this too. "They think in terms of abundance," a British supply officer observed. "We think in terms of scarcity. We calculate what we need and try to get it. They calculate what they need and then bring twice that much just in case." This wasn't criticism. It was recognition of 2 different military cultures. Britain had been stretched to its limits. America, untouched by bombing, with its factories running at full capacity, brought excess because they could. They brought redundancy because they had it. They brought overwhelming force because that was how they planned to win. On June 5th, the weather improved slightly. Operation Overlord was on. British officers watching from shore witnessed a choreographed ballet of steel and steam. 6,939 vessels moved past, organized into lanes, each lane moving at prescribed speeds. The channel became a highway of ships stretching to the horizon. On June 6th, the bombardment ships opened fire. The landing craft went in at 0630 hours. Thousands of them, wave after wave. At Omaha, German resistance was fierce, but the sheer number of American vessels offshore meant that even with heavy casualties, more troops kept coming, more supplies kept landing, and more fire support kept hammering German positions. The American vessels that had packed British harbors for months were now shuttling across the Kintechendigithin across the Nvith-Center-Tefansin, were now shuttling across the channel in continuous operation, bringing the material weight of American industry to bear on Nazi Germany. In his final report, Admiral Ramsey was precise. The American contribution of approximately 3,000 vessels was essential to achieving the required scale of assault. But in private conversations, British officers were more direct. "We knew they were rich," one British captain wrote. "But knowing it and seeing it are different things. Seeing thousands of ships all built in the last 2 years, that was when you understood what American industrial power actually meant." The fleet that had filled British harbors in the spring of 1944 represented a fundamental shift in the war. The British had been planning Overlord for years, calculating requirements. The Americans showed up and exceeded every calculation, brought more than anyone had thought possible, and made it look routine. They'd asked for an invasion fleet. The Americans had delivered an armada that made the Spanish armada look like a coastal patrol. That was the knowledge British generals carried with them, the physical manifestation of a nation's industrial will, concentrated on a single objective, applied with overwhelming force. And they understood, watching those ships fill the horizon, that this was how the war would be won.